that we're turning to Romans chapter 12, beginning with the 9th verse. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, there was a preacher who was walking down the street one day, and he saw two little boys standing on the porch of a house across the street where he was walking. The boys were trying to reach the doorbell, but they were short little guys and could not reach the bell. After he watched them for a while, he had caught up to their position on the street, and he walked across the street, right up behind the little boys, put his hand on one of them's shoulder and reached over and rung that bell. Then he got down where he could see the little guys in the eye, and he said, "All right, boys, now what?" And they looked up at him and said, "We run!" Sometimes our best intentions can go astray. Too often, we think that we can only be who we are. When I wrote this, I was thinking that Shakespeare was the one that said, "To thine own self be true." But I do believe that was Aristotle Shakespeare was quoting. But anyhow, who cares if Shakespeare or Aristotle said it? God did not. Through Scripture, in fact, God often calls us to be somebody that we are not. God often calls us to be somebody that's very difficult to be. If we were always true to ourselves, always acting as the person that we are, for one thing, we would never grow. We'd be satisfied with exactly who we are, how we are right now, all the time, and no growth would ever happen in our lives. We would never learn anything new because, well, we're fine just the way we are. I'm being myself just the way I am. We would never learn anything. We would never follow Jesus Christ, nor would we listen for the voice of God speaking in our lives. Because at its very core, our self is sinful. If we're true to ourselves, then what we're going to be, our whole character, everything about us, everything we do, everything we say, is going to be rooted in sin, and we will be sinful along with all of our actions and our words. What we will not be is followers of Jesus Christ in a way that we have come to call Christian. That's why God gave us not only Scripture, but continuing revelation that we talked about last week, so that we can learn how to be less true to ourselves and more true to Jesus Christ. Back in the 1950s, a guy who was at that time a famous Bible teacher in England described a scene in the early Christian church, like first century. A notable citizen in the community had been converted to Christianity. And this great guy in the community shows up for worship for the first time. He enters a room where the service is being held, and the leader of the worship service said, "Sit right over there, please." And the guy said, I can't sit there. I'd be sitting next to my slaves if I sat there. And the guy looked him in the eye and said, sit right over there, would you please? And he said, you cannot mean that I have to sit by my slave. Would you sit right over there, please? And so, the great man of the community walked over, sat down by his slave, and as was the custom at the time, gave him the kiss of the peace of Christ. That's what Christianity, and only Christianity, could do in the Roman Empire. It broke down all social barriers when people came to worship. And from that, more things happened. But we know from Scripture that that is not a tale that was made up, or even if it was, that it was true to history, because if you've read Philemon, Paul's letter to Philemon is a letter, very short letter, asking Philemon not to execute Onesimus, the runaway slave that Paul was sending back home. And we know from history that Onesimus became the bishop of the church where he and Philemon worshipped. Not only were they equals, the slaves in the church could surpass their masters in the field. Something only the church can do. You see, in those days, the church not only knew and taught that God sees no difference between the several sins, God sees no difference between the several people either. We are all God's children, and God treats us all as though we are all God's children, and expects us to treat one another just exactly that way, as though we are all peers all the time. Well, that's the story of the slave. And that and much of what Jesus said and a lot of what Paul taught. And today's lesson in particular sounds to our ears particularly almost un-American. You know, I mean, country clubs and all that stuff are designed to keep people out who are less than us. But once upon a time, that stuff did not seem strange or un-American at all. Early in this country's life, if one person in the community was in trouble, the whole community was in trouble. If one family was hurting, the whole community was hurting. It was everybody's job to help everybody else all the time, because they knew communities in those days were often so small that if they did not take care of one another, they could all die. We used to know a lot more about being a community than we do now. We used to know that we depend on one another. These days, more often than not, we think we depend on ourselves, our possessions, and our machinery, because they will take care of us. But if we don't oil them, they won't. All my life, I have known that my great-grandfather on my father's side, my father's father's father, no grandmothers involved this way, third generation Easton back, lost the family fortune in the Great Depression. Now, for whatever reason, I did not have this fact in my head. It was never told to me. But I thought that, like so many others, he had lost the family farm to the bank in the Great Depression. But no, that's not what happened at all. I came to learn recently. I learned that my great-grandfather did not lose the farm. He lost the family store. There's a big difference there. Because what happened, you know, in those days, early part of the 20th century, lots of people paid by the month or 6 months or by the year when the crop came in or whatever. And so shopkeepers, grocers, those kind of folks, they kept books. And they knew what everybody owed in town, and folks would come in and pay on it as they could, or when the crop came in, or whatever. Well, when the great, in the South, I don't know if y'all had any worries about that here, but in the South, right before the Great Depression, was the boll weevil that ate up all the cotton in the universe. And the farmers that weren't in trouble from the boll weevil were in trouble from the Great Depression. And nobody had any money by then. And he just kept keeping the books. He had money. During the first quarter of the 20th century, my grandfather was born in 1907. So his kids were out. He was the last of the children. He was out of the house by then. My great-grandfather had made good money during the first part of the 20th century. He had plenty of money. Shelves were stocked, kids were out of the house. It didn't bother him that he was spending their inheritance as he kept on buying groceries and seeing them walk out the door and no money coming in. They were his neighbors. He had, they did not have. Some of them would come in and pay sometimes when they had any money, but as you can tell, at the beginning of the story, I said he lost the family fortune. Before the Great Depression was over and anybody else was making any money, he ran out of money, he ran out of store, he ran out of ability to take any loans, he ran out of everything. And he joined the ranks of those who could no longer afford to pay. I gotta tell you, he took no small amount of grief from friends and family who wanted to know how in the world he could do a thing like that. How could you do a thing like that? What kind of businessman acts like that? I don't know what kind of businessman acts like that. But I know what kind of person acts like that. Because you see, the kind of person who acts like that could care less about treasures you can store up at the First National Bank, where bank runs and depressions and recessions and boll weevils can eat it up. That kind of person cares only about the treasures that can be stored up in heaven, where bank runs and boll weevils cannot reach. Now, I don't know about the faith of my great-grandfather. I don't know if he was in the church every Sunday or was never in church. But I know from his actions, if, as James said, faith without works is dead, then it must be works that show our faith. Show me your faith by your words, and I will show you mine by my works, James wrote. If faith is shown by works, then I know that my grandfather knew one thing. He knew who was number one, and it wasn't him.